Hey guys, Waddock Studios here, and today we're going to go over a subject matter that is literally on fire on the internet, and that is anti-aliasing and Unreal Engine 5 and combating temporal smear. So, little backstory. In the past, I've done a series. I've gone over how to target 8th-gen platforms, how to go from deferred rendering to forward rendering, how to go from DirectX 10 to DirectX 11, what the different shader models between SM5 and SM6 mean for your project. And all of these can be found in your project settings. You'll see SM5 and SM6 entries here. I'm in DirectX 12 RHI right now, and I've done this because that's the default. I am in software ray traced Lumen instead of hardware ray tracing, just because that's what I want to do, and I don't want any hardware ray tracing to be relevant within the kind of the benchmarking that I'm showing you today. So we are in shader model SM6, but we have shadow maps set to shadow maps and not VSM. So technically, like, we can walk this back. Like, if let's ask the question, what if you wanted to develop a deferred rendering game in Unreal Engine 5.5.4 without any modifications to the source, but you wanted to support Lumen? As of the latest hotfix, Lumen is only supported in SM5 and Vulkan and Metal. In DirectX, for whatever reason, I have two PRs open right now. They have a CVAR in main, but it hasn't made it into any hotfixes. It's called r.Lumen.Supported.sm5, and you just have to toggle the CVAR to 1 to force Lumen support. But as of it standing right now, you have to at least be in shader model 6, and you have to be in DirectX 12. So no more DX11 support, and no more SM5 support for DirectX at all if you want to run Lumen, until that CVAR in main makes its way down into a release. I do have PRs up if you want to go grab that to be able to go back, but that's where we stand. So I'm in the latest shader model SM6 DirectX 12, and I've simply made my shadows cheaper because I'm not using nanite in this example. So say we wanted to use UE5 as it stands today, and we want to, I'm on a 2080 Ti, by the way, but say we wanted to target, we wanted to give ourselves the largest amount of headroom that we can, and we wanted a, decently looking scene. Well, the only way to obtain that right now is if you're in TSR, is to go to your scalability settings and bump that screen percentage down to quality. That's going to give you your best quality with some upsampling. Now, what you're going to get as a result is artifacting of some type somewhere. You're going to get denoise artifacting. You're going to get temporal smear artifacting. Your NVIDIA card or your AMD card, because TSR is not an NVIDIA solution or a AMD solution. It is built into Unreal Engine. It is their upsampling method. It does a fairly good job, but it's not without its flaws. And as you can see here, the resolution that I'm at and upscaling from is 66% of my native resolution, and I am at 1080p when I full screen. So with a 2080, in order for me to hit 120 frames per second, which is like, the best, let's actually uncap. We will do t.max FPS. and we will just bump this up to something crazy. So like 7 milliseconds is my starting overhead cost. That gives me a lot of playing room to target 60 frames per second, right? So this is a pretty ideal situation. However, if I move my screen around, you can see right above, and I mean, with the compression on YouTube, you might not be able to see it, but you can see there's some nasty stuff happening around the guy's body, and in shadowed areas. Ignore the lumen artifacting. That's just software ray tracing doing its thing. But anytime you go from a lighter to darker scene and you move around, you're gonna see this really nasty artifacting that happens in TSR with upscalers, and it gets worse as you go from quality mode down to, say, like performance mode. So if I was to come over here to the engine scalability settings and we were going to bump this down to performance, which is 50% of your native resolution, so 50% of 1080p, it gets even worse, and it becomes really evident even with the compression that you're probably seeing through YouTube. This is what makes games have that muddy look. Now you'll see my frame rate's at 150 and we're down to 6 milliseconds, and that's great and everything. And for something where we're pumping lumen and nanite with hardware ray tracing into a game, you start to see where you're bumping that resolution down to kind of save on your VRAM cost and save on your texture compression cost. So you're trying to save everywhere because you've pretty much eaten your GPU and CPU up at, in that type of pipeline. Now, let's say we want to target the Steam Deck, or we want to target some older hardware, HN consoles, etc. How would we accomplish that without having, like, and for lack of better words, how would we stay native to a 1080p with a decent AA method without introducing a lot of artifacting, but yet keeping the frame rate really good? Well, I would say go back to the dreaded TAA or FXAA or some other anti-aliasing method and forego upscaling. Like, that path is still available to us in the engine. If you're on forward rendering, then of course go with MSAA. It's a no-brainer. You're already in a really fast rendering pipeline. Just keep an eye on your dynamic light usage. But unlike many would make you believe, you can totally do day-night cycles in forward rendering, especially with tile-based lighting architecture. So if you want to target the Switch or the Steam Deck and you want dynamic lights, you're going to lose lumen, software ray traced lumen, but you'll still be able to have dynamic scenes. You'll have to use stationary lights, bake, so you can save. It'll cost you a little bit on VRAM, but it's not going to be anywhere near the performance hit that you would incur. And I would say if you're not pumping all of these extra technologies from the UE5 pipeline into your game, if you're not relying on VSM or shader model 6, SM6, or just go back to DX11 or use Vulkan and go to SM5, spend less on your shader model, unless you want software ray traced lumen. And even then, I have lumen enabled in the scene because I wanted to show you guys that we can easily come into the project settings and go into AA. And I just want to show you the difference. So if we go to FXAA, it's a post-process method. It's really cheap, but it looks like dog crap right now because, of course, I went and we are technically upscaling on an FXAA. So we'll go back to native to get that back, and then we'll go into full screen, and you'll see I'm still down at 7 milliseconds with FXAA, and you're going to get some edge crawl here because the anti-aliasing method is a little bit different. but you're not going to get the same smearing that you would get from TAA, just because the algorithm on the anti-aliasing method is a lot different. And at a native 1080p, this is going to look pretty decent, and it's not going to start looking bad until it's scaled across a 4K panel. But if you want to be able to natively scale your resolution and you want it to look okay, yes, we're going to have to go to TAA. And you'll also see these other AA methods, even at a native resolution, are a lot cheaper than the initial cost you pay for upscaling. So, like, yeah, while they save you, like there's a kind of a bell-shaped curve on the fall off, it costs you up front to enable upsamplers, but then the more you toss into your scene, the more draws you have, and the more complex your GPU cost becomes, the overall goal is to save you in the long run. These other AA methods are just simply a post-process method, and they're frankly just going to be cheaper. The problem with TAA in Unreal Engine, I don't want to say Unreal Engine 5, I'll just say with Unreal Engine in general, is that people don't know how to control it. So if you apply the default TAA and we look at this at a native 1080p, first thing you're going to see is you get really bad smearing, and it doesn't help anything that Unreal Engine's default post-process setting is enabling motion blur. So you probably want to go disable motion blur, and I'm in world settings instead of my details panel, but you don't want this 0.5 motion blur, because your LCD panels nowadays have a natural blurring effect because they ghost based on their technology, what they are. On a CRT or something, maybe a high end, low millisecond refresh OLED panel, then you might want to introduce some motion blur, but you're going to get that natively. So I don't even understand why we're telling our GPU to introduce additional blur here whenever 90% of us are rocking LCD panels. So I, by default, go find motion blur in my project settings, and I disable it here, because that means it's disabled and it takes an override on the post process to even re-enable this. So now you'll see I'm still getting a blur, but I'm not getting as much of a blur, and it's more the temporal smearing that's coming from TAA. And you'll see even natively I'm bumping into 7 milliseconds. So now we've got a much cleaner movement in our image when we move around, even with TAA. And another thing I want to introduce you guys to, because it really does make life easier when you start dealing with console variables, is this console variable editor. I already have it enabled, but I'm going to show you, like, it tracks everything you're doing in your project, and it makes it really easy for you to look at and go, what have I done during my editor session? And then once you find something you're really good with, this can go in your default I underneath your engine rendering settings. So you can say, like, if someone enables TAA, this is what I want the behavior of that TAA enabled to perform like. So the reason I bring this up is because TAA, in its default state by its nature from Unreal, and it's not to say that, like, they're not going for a specific look, because I think they are, but it's very aggressive. It overly blurs and kind of smooths out this image to my taste and to many taste. And if you go to other games like Far Cry, or Ubisoft's engine, or Frostbite engine that have TAA methods in them, Red Dead, etc., you'll notice that, like, Unreal, comparatively speaking, is like almost feels like its own TAA when compared to other games. It's aggressively kind of blurring out your native image. And this is not as bad at 4K as it is at 1080p. And maybe that's why. Maybe they're targeting stretching this across a larger panel. But this is where, as a studio or as developers, you're going to have to play your game. And I would recommend going in and tweaking the TAA settings until you find something that you're happy with. Now, I'm going to include the CVAR settings in the description of this video, but these CVAR settings for TAA is something that I've discovered just from playing with like deferred rendering in a VR headset. So anyone who's done VR development knows when something is that close to your eyes and your FOV is what it is in VR, forward rendering is almost a must. And any game that doesn't do forward rendering super samples deferred rendering pipelines, like say Skyrim or The Forest or any deferred rendering like driving simulator game. You're going to be super sampling that. So you're going to be using a temporal based anti-aliasing method very sparingly, and then you're going to be, No Man's Sky does this, and then you're going to be super sampling the native resolution to get sharper edges. In forward rendering, MSAA kind of does this. It finds the edge on the base path and it basically super samples only the edge without distorting or blurring your textures or your textile density. So that's why forward looks so clean in VR versus in deferred. We don't have a cheap MSAA method that can run on top of the G buffer just because of the way the rendering pipeline works and how it defers its lighting data. So yeah, TLDR is, I've tested this out a lot. I've come up with my own kind of TAA, temporal AA settings, and we'll find the CVAR real quick so I can show you guys. And this is going to be the current frame rate, weight, and I usually set this to like a 0.5. The next CVAR that I change is the temporal AA samples. I just saw it, and I usually set this to like 4. And then the next CVAR is the Tonemapper.Sharpen. And this just adds a little bit of sharpening back to the image after you've adjusted your frame rate and your sample rate. So once you have these set, now if we go hit play and we full screen this, I would argue that this TAA setting here comes really, and this is it in motion. Your smearing is going to cut, your ghosting is going to be cut back drastically just because of your sample. And the sharpening that you're adding back to the image, it's not going to add any details back for you, but it is going to take away that harsh blurring that you get out of your default AA method. And this is going to scale across a 4K panel beautifully, and it's going to look good in motion if you're not introducing any artificial blur, motion blur. So, you know, I don't think there's enough due diligence on sharing this information with people. TAA is horrid. A lot of us don't like it, but there are ways to make it better than the way that it comes by default. And I don't know if this is just like, you know, people's little golden nugget that they're holding close to their chest or whatever. But as you can see, my frame rate's at 7 milliseconds. If I was on DX11, I would get even better performance out of this 20 series, this 2080 Ti. The memory bandwidth on these cards just aren't that great. So like, they really should be called quote unquote DX12 ready and not DX12 cards. But I will say that 5.5.4, as far as the DX12 RHI goes, it's a lot more stable even on these older cards than what it is in 5.3 and 5.4. So that's the good news. If you want to target DX12 with non-hardware lumen for PC, and you're targeting native resolutions. You're not wanting to use an upscaler that's going to give you really bad either a muddy look because you're coming from such a small native resolution, or artifacting all over the place, and you want something like this. We can still use 8th gen philosophies and target a native 1080p image, and then use the hardware, the panel itself, to scale that, to upscale that to 4K if a person chose to run at 1080p. But you should also be able to bring this method up to 4K relatively cheaply, no different than an 8th gen game can run at 4K on pretty decent hardware. This 20 series card would have no problem running these native settings right here with TAA at 4K. And this still gives me a crap ton of headroom in deferred rendering to use that cheaper G-buffer deferred lighting method and have dynamic scenes, and then also be pretty cheap on my shadows because I'm using shadow maps instead of virtual shadow maps. If you want to go the nanite and lumen path together, you're gonna have to go VSM. You're gonna have a heavier overhead cost, and eventually with nanite software rasterization, you're probably gonna need a form of DLSS or FSR, even on your top of the line 40 and 50 series cards. It's just the nature of the game right now. But I would say you don't have to go that route. These paths are still there. I wanted to share that TAA isn't like it's bad, but it can be a lot better, and you have a means to get there. And I'll pop these CVARs up on the screen from the CVAR console variable display for you guys so you can see them. And I would suggest doing a little bit of digging into these settings as you're playing your game if they don't work for you. If you see artifacting or some type of jitter, like really strong jitter, because that's what temporal sampling is going to do if you don't have the settings right, then you can adjust your samples, or you can adjust your frame weight and find something that works better for you. I find that 5 to 6 samples seems to introduce a lot of vibration and stuttering. So these are just the settings that work for me. And again, I'll try to copy this kind of overview and leave it in the description. I hope this has been helpful to you guys. 5.5.4 hotfix has just come out, I think yesterday or day before yesterday. Until next time, leave me a like and subscribe if you haven't already thought about joining the Wild Ox Studios family. It'd be lovely to have you. We do have a Discord, so hit me up with any suggestions or questions over there, and consider becoming a member of the YouTube family and joining the Wild Ox Studios YouTube family. It helps, and it incentivizes me to keep making videos like this. Until next time, guys, toodles.